What's up, everybody? Thank you for checking this video out. Tonight, John and I had an amazing privilege to interview Miss Marcia Montenegro from Christian Answers for the New Age, and we talked to her about astrology. We heard a little bit of her testimony, and this is just a fantastic video. I hope this encourages you, informs you, all that good stuff. In the recording of it, the first couple minutes did get cut off. I think we missed the first 2 or 3 minutes of the video, but just to catch you up to speed again, this is Marcia Montenegro from Christian Answers for the New Age. I hope you guys find this helpful. Grace and peace.
Creating a chart, so you're given the data and you have to know the mathematical equations to calculate the chart, which was very hard for me to learn because math is like my worst subject.
Okay.
And that just shows how much I wanted to do it, the fact that I went through all that horrible math stuff. And then the second part of the exam is they give you a chart of somebody, a real person. They don't tell you who it is. They don't even tell you if it's a man or a woman. And you have to write out an interpretation of it as though you're talking to the person whose chart it is. So you have to pretend that that's the chart of a client and you're talking to that person and you write out what you would say. So it's a very difficult exam, and only about half the people at the time who took the exam passed.
Okay.
And I eventually was on the board of astrology examiners, and then I was chairperson. And so we formulated the exam and graded it. So I know exactly what the test is like from that very intimately. And then I, bought a business license. I became professional, and I started getting clients. I actually had been practicing on people before I got my license.
Okay.
I would charge like a little, like $10 or something, and practice and tell people that I was still learning, would they mind me, trying to do a chart for them. So most people were very happy to do that. And so I got practice for 2 years on people before I bought my license. And then, of course, as I did it, I got more and more skilled at it. I was very much absorbed in astrology and saw things through an astrological and New Age worldview. And then just briefly how I got out of it, because if I start telling how in more detail, it will take too long.
Sure.
But the story is on my website, christiananswersforthenewage.org. So it's there. And I basically, God intervened in my life. And over a period of several months, I would say starting around April into, November, a lot of different things happened. That led me to reading the Bible, actually, which I didn't understand. And it was while I was reading the Bible, and I was reading a passage in Matthew 8, that God opened my eyes and I saw who Jesus was. Really, for the first time in my life, even though I had been to churches and Sunday school when I was younger. I had never understood Christianity. I didn't know what the gospel was. I didn't understand why Jesus died on the cross. I never got that all those years.
Okay.
So I finally understood. And at that moment, I gave my life to Christ. I did find out a few months later that a young man at an office where I was working part-time was praying for me with a group from his church, with a young adult fellowship group at his church.
Okay.
So, hey, I want to ask you, I should have asked you this before. This is like a side thing here. While I'm talking, should I look at my camera light or look at myself down here in the corner or look at the big black?
Look at your camera. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, you're doing great.
I realized I didn't ask that before, so I'm like looking all over the place because I'm not sure where I should.
No, yeah, you've been doing great. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I was looking at the camera light, but I wasn't sure. Okay, so sorry about that. So it's really it's obviously a God story, because I didn't want to leave astrology or the New Age. I didn't want to be a Christian. I had absolutely no interest in becoming a Christian.
Okay.
And so it was really my story on my website goes into it a little more, and there are some webcasts and podcasts where I tell my story too, if you
Okay.
Google that.
Awesome. Awesome. So God saved you despite your best efforts to not become a Christian.
Yes, exactly.
That's awesome. Praise God. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So that's, I think, a great overview and kind of a jumping off point. So you mentioned it a little bit on the test that there's sort of these different elements. So what does a session of astrology look like? Like there's like solar charts, is lunar charts, is that a thing as well? And like what are some of those other elements that people will look at as far as components of that?
Well, the chart is basically a picture. The birth chart is a picture of the position of the planets and the sun and the moon at the time of your birth, where you were born. So it will alter, if someone's born in San Francisco at a certain time, and at the same time somebody's born in Chicago, the charts are gonna be somewhat different, and they might be drastically different. Not drastically, but different enough.
Okay.
So the place and time is very important. It's actually local time. So
Okay.
that has to be calculated. Of course, now computers do that, but we had to learn how to do that to pass the test. And so you're looking at this circle, and the circle has the zodiac signs around it, Aries through Pisces, and they fall around. The circle is like a clock that moves makes a whole rotation in 24 hours. And it moves through the signs approximately every 2 hours. So every 2 hours, the signs change on the 12 houses. The circle is divided into 12 houses. And the first house is the eastern horizon. And so whatever constellation is on the eastern horizon at the time of your birth, that becomes your ascendant or your rising sign, which is a very important component of the birth chart. That's like almost as important as your sun sign. And then there's the moon sign. And then each planet will be around the chart, just depending on where the planets happen to be at that time. And they'll be in certain, depending on the time of day, they'll be in certain houses. So, your sun might be in the second house, or it could be in the 9th house or the 10th house. And those all have meanings.
Right.
All of the houses have meanings, and all of the zodiac signs have meanings, and all of the planets have meanings. So the astrologer is looking at this really very complicated picture and then putting it all together. So they're also looking at the distance of the planets from each other, because that means something. If two planets are near each other, that means something. If they're opposite, that means something. If they're 90 degrees away, that means something. If they're 60 degrees away, that means something. So the astrologer is looking at their positions to each other. So you might have, this person has their sun is in Leo, and it's in the 9th house. And then their moon could be anywhere. Their moon could be in Scorpio. And then their Venus is in a certain sign, Mercury, and they're looking at that and interpreting it. I don't think people understand how complicated it is. And I want to make a point here that the occult is actually extremely complicated. It's not simplistic. It's like very complex. And when you get into something like astrology, which is it could be perhaps the oldest occult art in the world, because it goes back so far, we don't even know, we know it was way back in ancient times. Mm-hmm. And the practice of magic or witchcraft, those are probably the oldest, sure. And spirit contact, oldest occult practices. When you get into something like astrology, where you have all these components, it's just incredibly complicated. And that is one of the things that draws people in. That's what drew me in, is that I found it very challenging. It wasn't a real simple 1, 2, 3.
Uh-oh, you still there?
Kind of
there you are.
Huh?
I was afraid we lost you there for a sec, but it sounds like we
No.
got your back.
Okay. Yeah, it was this thing that, I wanted to really learn and sort of master, although you never feel that you really master it because there's always more to learn. You can never get to the end of it because there's always these nuances to learn about each sign and each planet. I mean, I remember there was a whole book just on the planet Saturn in a person's chart and what the
Okay.
planet Saturn meant in all its different aspects of the chart. This was written by a Jungian psychologist named Liz Green, who was very popular with astrologers. And so a session with a person is looking at these components of the chart. And what you're really doing is you're not telling the future, which is what a lot of people think. You're talking about the person. It's really like a counseling session. And
Hmm.
so you're saying things like, I can see there was a very strong influence on your childhood from your mother, but it was very unstable. And, or I can see that your relationships tend to be with older people or people who are set in their ways. Or things like, I see that you tend to be drawn towards jobs and goals that have to do with dealing with the imagination or being creative. So those are the kind of things that the astrologer is saying to the client. They're
Okay. So
talking about who you are, your personality, your influences on you, your relationships, childhood issues, et cetera, et cetera. And
okay.
that's all coming from the chart. It's all the person in
Gotcha. Okay, well,
the
I
chart.
guess that kind of branches into two different questions I had, and one of them is sort of what is the relationship there? Like you're talking about how different planets and distances and things like that. That all has a meaning. So I guess my first question is how much of that is sort of a science in terms of okay, if we know that Saturn and Venus, there's some kind of a 90-degree relationship or something like that. So how
Yeah.
much of that is a science versus an interpretation? I guess we'll maybe start with that question. I don't want to I don't want to ask too much all at once. But yeah,
Okay.
how much
Yes.
is sort of a science, a laid out type of a thing versus just the interpretation of the individual astrologer?
None of it is science.
Okay, okay, that's helpful.
The mathematical calculation is math, and
Hmm.
you are calculate. Of course, the constellations have moved over 2,000 years, and they aren't exactly where there's the fixed zodiac belt, and
Okay,
that is what most astrologers use. And the zodiac belt actually has shifted, so they're not even that is not scientific, but in the sense of how they're calculating the position of things, they are using something called an ephemeris, and that is actually an astronomical guide to position of planets at various times of the day, any time of the day. Well, it gives you noon or midnight, and then you have to figure out the other times. But they're using some astronomical data to compute the chart and the position of the planets. So that is semi-scientific. The math that you do is scientific, just the
but
math
that's about
by
it.
itself. The interpretation is all, none of that is scientific. This is all coming, going way back to really to pagan gods. Ares, the god of war.
Hmm.
It's there's still retained that meaning is kind of there, although of course it's becomes more psychologically complex with the advent of psychology around the turn of the 20th century. Psychology started to be um, inserted into the chart.
Right,
And
you
so,
got Carl
um,
Jung and his influence there. That was
and
my other question. Yeah.
Carl Jung had a big influence, and then psychology in general. And so instead of looking at the chart like maybe they did in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, where they would say things like, oh, you're going to marry a man who dies young, or your children will be in the poorhouse or something. They would have these fatalistic readings, and
Mm.
honestly, I don't even know how they did them because that isn't the kind of interpretation I learned or I used. We use the psychological interpretation mostly, and occultic, because these meanings, a lot of the ideas in a chart reading come from the occult. A lot of astrologers, for example, believe in reincarnation.
Hmm.
And so when you're doing the chart for the person, that comes into play in the reading.
Okay.
If you're an astrologer who believes in, and I did believe in reincarnation. And there's something called the moon's nodes, which is the path of the moon where it intersects with the path of something intersects with something going around the earth. I can't remember now.
Okay.
It's like the path of there's a south node and a north node, and it's the I think it's the moon's path around the earth and where it intersects with the sun or something. I have to look it up. And so the south node is supposed to indicate in the chart your past life and what you're bringing into this life, and the north node indicates where you're going. They're always opposite each other.
Okay.
So that's another component of the chart. So there's a spiritual and occult and psychological mingling of information. It's all kind of mingled together. And depending on the astrologer who's doing it, one area might be more emphasized than the other area. Some astrologers are more skilled at more practical advice, like they can look at the chart and supposedly give you like financial advice, something that I never tried to do.
Okay.
But I was very spiritual and psychologically oriented. So that tended to be where that's where I focused on for the person. But that's all coming from the supposed meanings of the planets and the zodiac signs and the 12 houses.
Okay.
So but it corresponds. Here's why it sometimes seems to work. There's a correspondence between the way the chart is from Aries to Pisces with phases of life. So Aries is like the birth of the individual, and it's very ego-oriented. And then Taurus is the discovery of the material world. So Taurus is a very materialistic sign that's sensual, that likes feeling things, that may like money.
Okay.
Then you go to Gemini, which is the mental sign, where the mental powers are discovered. So Gemini is very curious and likes to talk and likes to communicate. And then you get to, these are general attributes. It doesn't mean everyone who's Gemini is like that. I'm just giving you the general ideas behind this.
Sure, but the idea is, though, that it
has to do with the home and feeling rooted and grounded. And if you look at the life of a child, you see that it corresponds. A child first discovers himself as separate from his mother, as his own person. Then he begins to he feels himself. Little babies like play with their feet, or they play with toys. They're
Sure.
discovering their sensations.
There's stages of the
and
human
then they
development.
begin to talk. That's Gemini. They begin to talk and they begin to think, to observe, and then they get into where they're attached to their home, and so you can make a correspondence through a person's phase of life that way. And the other way astrology does it is they do it in this very esoteric fashion too, where there's like these meanings behind the signs that are more esoteric and spiritual. So it's, I don't want to get too technical here, but
Sure.
there's just so much there that if you have an interest in this, whether you're an astrologer or you're going to an astrologer, it just draws you in. It's very, very seductive. It's very seductive.
So when you're, you mentioned going back to pagan roots and having some occult-driven aspects of it. Would you consider it a form of divination specifically? Are you contacting spirit guides like some other practices? What exactly does that side of it entail?
Yes, it is actually both. You're right. It's definitely a form of divination. And so all the passages in scripture that condemn divination, that would include astrology. And it also involves, although not directly, but it ends up that it involves spirit contact because, for example, myself, I actually had a spirit guide before I started studying astrology, but all my friends who were astrologers had spirit guides. And they were very open about it, at least among ourselves, we were open about it. I don't know that I ever shared that with a client.
Okay.
I don't think I don't think I ever said anything about having a spirit guide to a client. I'm positive I never did.
Okay.
It was something that I took for granted, and that my friends who did astrology, other astrologers, took for granted. So it's and that's actually very common in the New Age.
Okay.
We were all kind of New Agers. We were all New Age astrologers.
Okay.
And
Now,
so, there's spirit contact and divination. Yeah.
so at that time, when you were doing this and you had a spirit guide, would you have attributed getting that knowledge that you would have, that you would relay to your clients? Would you attribute that? I mean, obviously you said you wouldn't verbally attribute that, but like, did you think that you were getting that information from your spirit guide, or did you think you were just pulling that from the data, the charts, things like that, or how did that work?
I thought it was both.
Okay.
I often, it was a combination. Like, I would be looking at the chart. I would look at the chart before I would see the person to kind of get an idea of it. And then when I saw the person, or when I taped it, I often did charts for people I never met, and I taped them and sent them the tapes. So sometimes I never saw the person, because a lot of people have told me, well, you just were reading body language. And it's like, no, because I did charts for people I never met. And when the person was there, I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the chart. And I actually preferred to do charts for people I didn't know, because if I knew the person, I felt that my knowledge of that person got in the way. So I actually didn't like to do charts for people I knew, or that I knew very well. And so I think I looked at the chart, and I'm sort of putting together the information in my mind. Okay, the moon is here next to Saturn, and I know that that can mean this or this or this. And then once I started talking to the person, as I would be talking, I would usually feel guided through the chart. And I would feel guided to certain places in the chart very strongly, like, oh, I need to go over here and talk about, this sun and Venus together in the, fourth house, or something like that. And I would feel very, very strongly drawn sometimes. And then other times, and actually this happened, it may not have happened with every chart reading, but it happened fairly often with a lot of chart readings. While I was looking at the chart, something would suddenly come into my mind, like that seemed extraneous to the chart. Like, I would suddenly have a picture in my mind, or some kind of information would enter my head, and I would say it to the person, and then they would be shocked that I knew that. And that was really like a psychic. That was a psychic kind of revelation.
Right.
And that I definitely attributed to my spirit guides.
Okay.
Definitely.
And then now that you're saved on this side, you can see that the spirit guide is some kind of a demonic figure, basically just giving you information in order to seduce both you and your client at the time.
Exactly. And everybody who does these kind of things, astrologers, tarot card readers, palm readers, all of these people, mediums who claim to contact the dead, all of these people have guides, and usually they know it, and they're getting some of the information that way. And that is why sometimes they're very accurate. I mean, of course, you can be accurate by coincidence.
Sure.
And sometimes that can happen. Or you can be accurate because you're saying things that would be generally true for a lot of people.
Right.
Or people hear what you say, and then they apply it specifically to their own circumstance. So those are other ways that it seems to work. But often, if a specific thing is given to you, I'll give you actually, there's two examples. One was, I was doing a chart for actually somebody that I knew. And I was at the end of the chart, I would do forecasting, where I looked at the influence of where the outer planets, the more slower moving outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are compared to the chart. And then and Saturn too. And you give kind of a more long-term forecast based on that. And I was telling him what that was. And then sometimes I would give advice to people, like how to deal with that particular thing. And so what I said to him was, because as I was talking to him, I suddenly had a picture in my head of him skydiving. And I said, you know what, David, I think that you should try something really new. You need to break out of the box and out of your routine. And I think maybe you should sign up for skydiving lessons. And he looked at me, he had this look of shock on his face. And he said, I can't believe you said that. I just signed up 2 days ago for skydiving
Wow.
lessons. So you see, that information was fed into my brain.
Sure.
I think because I had no idea he had done that.
Right.
So that information, there's no way I could have known that.
Right.
And that's almost too much of a coincidence, I think, to say it was coincidental.
Exactly. It's not exactly the same thing as saying, oh, I sense you've had a loss sometime in the, your recent past or something. And it's like, who hasn't, that really thinks about it.
Right.
Okay.
Well, astrologers generally, if they're looking at the chart, they'll be a little more specific. They might say you had a loss. And they won't necessarily say a loss through death, but they might say something like, maybe going back in childhood, like you had an absent mother, or you had, actually, this was another example. I was talking to someone and I saw the planets in her fourth house, which has to do with the mother and early childhood. And what I saw there would not be seen necessarily usually as a good thing. And I saw what I felt was something serious. And as I was saying, I think your childhood, your relationship with your mother was very difficult. And as I was talking, I suddenly had a very strong impression that her mother had been mentally ill. And so I said, I think you were separated from your mother for periods of time. And she also looked very surprised and said, how did you know that? My mother had mental problems and was sent away a few times in my childhood to these asylums, or mental hospitals. So I had things like that would happen to me. And I really felt sure those were coming from the spirit guides, and they probably were.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So overall, though, you would say that it's as far as astrology being effective and accurate, you would say that it's probably a combination of demonic things, potentially just a placebo effect type of thing, like people kind of hearing what they want to hear. Is that something that plays a role as well? Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors. There's not just one or two.
Sure.
I think there's several factors at work where it seems to be so accurate. And I mean, all my clients would tell me how accurate it was and how much it helped them, and how, I remember one person said, you're even better than my therapist. You even understand me and know more about me than my therapist.
Wow.
So, people don't understand. And this is what I really want Christians to understand. Things like this from the occult are very powerful, and they're not something that you can take lightly. So it's not, if you sit down to read your horoscope column in the newspaper for fun, even though the horoscope column is a very, very, very watered down form of astrology.
Okay,
it's
sure.
so watered down that it seems almost meaningless. Yet there can be a little hook in there that draws you to it, because you could read it for that day and it might say something that is just dead on accurate. And then you get curious, and then you start wondering, well, I'm going to look at it and see what it says tomorrow, and it's a seduction. And so that's why it's so important for us to have nothing to do with this. And this is what God warns us. Well, he warns us against these things because these practices actually originally were connected to the worship of false gods. And this is how people found out the will of their gods, or got guidance from their gods, supposedly. But it's also because it's a seduction, and it seems helpful. It seems like it's a helpful thing to people.
Right. Okay, so just to clarify, you would say that there is no safe level of, I'm just going to mess around with this for fun, like it's all, like we shouldn't do it. As disciples of Christ, don't mess with it. Don't touch it.
Don't look at your horoscope. Don't if somebody's on TV who's an astrologer and she starts talking about, you know, the different signs and these are the influences on you for the next 3 months. If you're a Sagittarius, you know, don't turn it off. Just switch it, because, you know, Satan can plant a little trap in there for you.
Right.
And knowing how powerful this stuff is, I have actually had to talk to a lot of Christians who came out of astrology. They either did astrology or they just were kind of self-taught and got into it. And several of them the reason they contact me is because they have a hard time getting away from it. They can't seem to get away from it. It has such a draw on them. They want to keep going back to it. And this is how and they know it's wrong, and they still want to do it. This is how powerful it is.
Just got the hook in there. Yeah, and that's and to kind of clarify for those of you guys who have maybe not seen some of the earlier videos that we did, like the one on demons, I definitely recommend that. But really what we kind of broke down is, you know, the goal of demonic forces is ultimately to keep your eyes off Christ. You know, it's not necessarily so much about they're trying to possess you and get you to, you know, cut somebody's face off or something, you know, like they're you know, it's a win for them if they keep your eyes off Christ, or if you're a believer, if they keep you in complete neutrality, not doing anything for the kingdom, you know, they'll take that as a win. Okay. So now, what are some of the practical problems of astrology in terms of, like, even, you know, not even just looking at, you know, obviously the scripture condemns it, but from practical problems, like some of the things that I've heard is that it's based on, you can confirm whether or not this is true, that astrology is based on a geocentric model of the universe. Is that accurate?
For most astrologers do use that. They were some astrologers, when I was towards the end of my astrological career, some astrologers were switching over to a heliocentric model.
Okay.
And I actually tried that a few times. I mean, I did the chart for the person as a heliocentric, but it just seemed so bizarre to me. It seemed weird to me.
Okay.
And I don't know. I wasn't drawn to that, but there are some astrologers that do that. I don't know that it's really caught on. I think the other kind of astrology that everybody is more familiar with, that all the books are based on, is still the main view in astrology.
Is the geocentric.
In the West, in the United States. Now, astrology differs, you know, like Chinese astrology isn't anything like astrology here. I mean, it's a completely different system, set up completely differently. And in India, even though there's some similarities, they use a different a way of calculating, and they also give more of a focus on the moon over the sun. Whereas in the West, the focus is on the sun. And so their interpretations differ, and that's also, a lot of that is cultural.
Okay.
So astrology is not consistent around the world at all.
Okay. Which also kind of debunks the, you know, argument of, okay, there's a lot of science behind it and things like that, because people do completely different things, and okay.
So, and yeah, like Native American astrology, completely different story. I mean, totally different from anything. So
maybe I missed it earlier, like when we're talking about the origins and where it begins, and you've got charts that kind of give these different guidelines, but you've got Native American that's different, Indian that's different, Chinese that's different. What's the viewpoint as far as where these charts originated at? Like where's the source, I guess?
I don't know the history of the Chinese and Native American astrology. I saw some books about them, and I read a little bit of, you know, like the Chinese astrology. You know, if you go to enough Chinese restaurants, they have like the year of the snake and the year of the dragon, or the year of the horse, you know. And then they divide the hours up in the day as to when you were born, and you go by that. And there may be more to it than that. That's as far as I ever got with it. And Native American astrology very much corresponds to animals also. But I don't know enough about it to even say more than that. The system that I used is actually astronomical data on the ephemeris. But there are different house systems. In other words, there are different ways you can calculate the 12 houses and where the zodiac signs are going to fall on them. So there is a difference in that. There's they have different names, and some are more popular than others. And I use a system called the Koch system, KOCH. I think it's because that's what I learned when I was taking the classes. But there's another system, the name I can't even remember of it, that was very popular. And if you do the chart with the Koch system, it comes out one way, and with the other system, it may be slightly different. And there's also the factor that if you go really far north, you're going to have whole signs missing. So like your 10th house might start on Aries, and then the 11th house, instead of going from Aries to Taurus, Taurus will be missing and it will be Gemini. You know, it's some kind of astronomical thing. It's just eclipsed out.
Interesting.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so I did have a few charts of that, and so you read it a little differently because that sign is it's there, but it's kind of missing. You
Okay.
don't see it, and you just give a different interpretation. People who do astrology are very adaptive people. You know, you adapt to what you're given, and you go with it. You know, you go with your gut, so to speak, and with your experience in doing charts, if you've been doing it for a while, and you just kind of, you know, it's just kind of there. You know, you just kind of go with it. There's nothing scientific about it at all. But
Gotcha.
the astrologer, you know, feels that this is truth, that they're looking at something that is truth, and this is truth about that person whose chart they're doing, and they feel very strongly about it. I mean, I was passionate about it. I was completely passionate about it.
Sure. So with I guess kind of on the note of if you're north enough, you know, some of those are missing. So another thing that I've heard in terms of a potential debunker of it from a practical standpoint is the idea of the precession of the equinox, that the Earth is kind of always shifting. So the signs and where people see them are just way off, to the point where it would just make any kind of, you know, a scientific argument completely arbitrary because it's always shifting. Is that true?
Yes, and I think I mentioned that earlier, where the zodiac belt is fixed, and that's what most astrologers use, and they aren't. The precession of the equinox means that the zodiac belt has shifted, and that's why the dates that you see, like in a horoscope column, aren't accurate anymore. Everybody's sign has shifted back, I think maybe close to 20 degrees. So maybe, you know, a lot of people are actually, not everybody, but a lot of people are actually the previous sign to what sign they are.
Wow.
So, you know, if you think that, you know, you're a Libra, you might actually be Virgo. And that, of course, would affect the position of other planets too. Now, here's the thing. Astrologers knew about that. I knew about the precession of the equinox. And here's how a lot of astrologers respond to that. The fixed zodiac belt is what's was there for a long time. And that was what astrology, the modern system of astrology, was based on. Therefore, there is still a truth to it, even if it's not accurate. Now, see, if you're in the New Age, you can think like that. You can think
you're okay with contradictions.
Well, yeah, not only, and it's because there's no objective truth in the New Age.
Right.
So if objective truth doesn't really exist or doesn't really matter, then, okay, so this chart I'm looking at isn't maybe technically correct because of the precession of the equinox, but it's correct in reality as to the truth of astrology. You know, that's the best way I can put it, because we knew about this. We knew some of the arguments against astrology. There was some astronomers in Atlanta that would from time to time challenge us to a debate. They would send a challenge to the Astrological Society and say, hey, why don't one of your astrologers come debate?
Interesting.
You know, none of us took us, because we just thought that was a waste of time, because we thought, well, we're not going to convince those people. And this was something that I heard a lot, and I actually said it myself. There is a higher truth than science. There's a higher truth than these facts out there that the scientists don't understand, and we're going by the higher truth. Now, see, this is a very New Age way of thinking.
You can see where the worldview is just entirely different. Just entirely different foundations, presuppositions, yeah.
Yeah, your worldview is so different that even when you hear these things, it doesn't affect you, because you have another way of rationalizing it in your mind, and you have a way of explaining that this is just, this is we're following this higher truth, and one day science will discover, that we were right all along. I mean, we felt very strongly like that. That was how I thought. I thought like that.
So with that mindset, when you had that, so thinking back, what is something, or if there's anything that, if you could go back and say something to yourself back when you were caught up in this to sort of break you of that, do you think there was anything specific that could have, made you rethink everything? Or do you think you were just so deep in that worldview that it was just, you would have just written everything off a priori?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I don't think anything would have convinced me. And that's why I tell people, if they're talking to somebody who's really into astrology, I tell them, don't give them scientific arguments against astrology. When I've given my talks on astrology, I may have a little section in the outline. These are the scientific reasons, these are the reasons it's not scientific. And then I'll say, but don't use that on people who believe in astrology, because it's not going to do any good. It's just a complete waste of time. So, unless they're already doubting and already questioning, then of course, you can share with them. But I would not use that approach, because I don't think it would work.
Okay, well, let's kind of shift then and look just real quickly at some of the arguments from the Bible here. So there's, I'm sure you're aware of a few different arguments that people who are for astrology will use from the Bible. So, so like one, looking at Genesis, in the creation account, and God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, and said these will be for signs and seasons. So people will say, oh, well, signs, that's sort of condoning astrology. We can look to, God's created order to learn things about ourselves, about the future, things like that.
Yes, and Jean Dixon, who was a very famous astrologer, used that argument too. She cited that passage. Of course, signs there does not have anything to do with the zodiac signs. Right. If you look at the Hebrew word, it actually has a range of meaning. I don't know Hebrew, but I've looked at these things because of my ministry dealing with the New Age, and so I've had to know how to answer these arguments. And so it can mean some kind of marker. It can even mean a miraculous sign, depending on the context. But there's no connection at all to the planets or as far as being a sign like a zodiac sign. And actually, God says, "I'm giving them to you for light," like in the next verse or something. I think He said, and these are given to you for light and for seasons. So it's for light and to mark time. Cool. And that's why God says that's the purpose of the heavenly bodies.
Okay, awesome. Now, next one. Now, this is one that I was not familiar with until a few days ago, and that is in Job 38, where God is speaking to Job, and he refers to the Mazzaroth. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
And that's supposedly the Hebrew word for the zodiac. So it's sort of God saying, hey, I set up this zodiac. And, then people will read into it, okay, well, since God set it up, it's, something valid for us to gain information from.
Yes, I've actually done 2 Facebook posts on that. And I should have reviewed them before I came on the program. But I kind of vaguely remember what I wrote.
Okay.
But they aren't sure. It does not mean zodiac signs. It just means constellations.
Okay.
So, and it's also a word that's not real clear as to the meaning, if I'm remembering correctly. But there's no way that it means the zodiac. So it means constellations. So basically, God's just talking about constellations of stars.
Sure.
And so that people, if you want to know more about it, just Google. I always tell people, actually, it's easier to Google stuff that I've written on Facebook than to use Facebook search. Sure. So you Google Mazzaroth Marcia Montenegro, Facebook, and it should come up.
Okay, cool. And then Christian Answers for the New Age too is your site. She's got amazing content there.
My Facebook page for my ministry, which is if people want to see what I'm writing, they should go to Christian Answers for the New Age. But when you're searching for something, for some reason it comes up. I think it comes up better with my name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
cool.
So I tell people to search using that name, the topic, my name, then Facebook, and usually things come up.
Awesome. Okay, so 2 more from the Bible. So one of them being the idea that, Daniel, when he was in Persia, was put in charge of all the astrologers and soothsayers and these guys. So therefore, Daniel was an occultist, and he's this great man of God, an Old Testament figure.
Right, yes. And by the way, on my website, I have an FAQ document, frequently asked questions. And I address that somewhere in there. I think that I have 4 or 5 pages. So awesome. I have some answers to questions like that, like the signs, the thing that you brought up from Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
I address that and some other issues like that there.
Cool.
The Daniel thing, yes, I've looked at that and I read that passage over and over again. And it doesn't say that he studied astrology. He was put over the astrologers because God gave him wisdom. Also, there's I don't have my Bible open in front of me, but it says that God gave him and his friends wisdom.
Right.
And so that, after they had the test with the diet and they refused to eat the food that the king had sent them, and they said, we can't eat this food, and you can test us after 10 days or something.
Right.
I can't remember the exact account now. And they were tested, and it says that God gave them all manner of wisdom. And then, of course, Daniel's put in charge because he interprets the king's dreams without the king doesn't even tell him the dream.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And God gives Daniel the information, and God gives Daniel the interpretation. And Daniel says, none of these wise men or astrologers can give you the answer. Only God can give the answer.
Right.
So the answer clearly doesn't have anything to do with astrology.
Cool.
And so the fact that he's put over these people doesn't mean he was an astrologer.
Sure.
And nothing in the account indicates that he practiced astrology or anything like that. So
cool. And we look to him too. When he's asked to do this, and what Daniel does, he doesn't go home and pick out his astrology chart and figure things out. He prays. He prays to God, and then God delivers him the information that he needs.
And I think it's so key that you're reading it in context with a lot of scriptures. Because I saw an interview with a lady just recently who was definitely performing divination and calling it Christian. She pointed to Joseph, when he sends the cup with his brother, and it says, tell them that was my cup for divination. And obviously he's presenting himself as a higher up in Egypt to still disguise himself to his brothers.
As part of the pagan kingship.
But when you have these individuals that cherry pick scripture and say, oh yes, that's the meaning, I can perform this.
Right.
What they're really appealing to is just their self. They want to do something no matter what the scripture actually says, which is why they take it out of context.
Yep, it's looking for a justification.
Yeah.
Right. And that's easy to do, when you take scripture out of context. That's and that's what people do. And most of these people who use those arguments they don't really know the Bible. And, they just know these little passages or find these passages and then try to use that to support their argument. And whenever you look at the context, you can take down the argument pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as another scripture that...
last one.
Another one that
That's okay.
a lot of times that will be used are the Magi that, are following the stars and leading them.
Yeah. So
what is typically your response if you have that?
Yes, and I have a big Facebook post on that.
Awesome.
I think I've done it like 4 times, and I updated it, and I think I put it up like right before this past Christmas of 2019, if you want to look for that. Yeah, and it's something like, do the Magi, do the Magi mean God endorses astrology or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, I've been asked about that probably more than any other passage ever since I became a Christian. And of course, the Magi probably did practice astrology along with some other things because they were wise men. And so they probably knew a little bit of whatever was considered medicine. They probably did dream interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
like the people at the court where Daniel had been. And they probably, looked at the planet. Now, of course, they didn't have the concept of planets then. They didn't know what a planet was, so they called it a star.
Sure.
But the planets, as we know, the planets move fairly fast compared to stars, which don't really move. I don't think stars move unless they fall or something. And then, of course, they move in terms of the Earth as the Earth moves. But the stars aren't traveling like the planets, especially the faster moving planets that can be measured. So like Mercury is a very fast moving planet. I think Venus, Mars goes around the Earth once in 2 years, every 2 years. And Venus is faster. So they saw these, what they thought were stars, moving very fast, and they gave a meaning to them as being gods or the homes of gods, and that's where the pagan ideas for astrology come from.
Mm-hmm.
But back to the Magi, so the Magi probably had that kind of outlook. This is my take on the star that they were following, and this is not my idea. I actually heard it, and I can't remember who I heard it from, but I know other people have this view. The star, first of all, it led them to Herod, right?
Whoops.
They go to Herod, and they ask where we're here for the king, and of course Herod's is like, what do you mean, what king? And then his advisors come out and say, well, it says here, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. So they leave. It seems to me that only the Magi saw the star. It doesn't seem to me that anybody else, Herod and his guys don't mention it. And then it leads them from there, and it says that it stood over the dwelling of Jesus. So to me, this is something supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the glory of God. I think it's like the Shekinah, the glory of God.
Like in Exodus.
Over the temple and over the in the wilderness, the
pillar of fire.
The tabernacle. Yeah, the tabernacle and the temple had the glory of God over it. And I think because, especially in John, it says that Jesus came and tabernacled among us.
Right.
So it makes a lot of sense to me that this would be a supernatural light indicating, Christ there, the
dwelling among his people.
Like the light, God's glory over the tabernacle.
Oh, I love that answer.
Yeah, that to me, it makes the most sense in terms of the whole account.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes the most sense in context, because when you look at the narrative about Jesus, even prior, when Mary's told by Gabriel that she will have a child and she's a virgin, everything about that is all supernatural. It's one supernatural thing after another.
Right.
Joseph is visited and told by an angel about it, and they're warned to flee, and the Magi are even warned. I think after they see Jesus, they're told by an angel not to go back to Herod.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's a chain of supernatural events. So to me, I don't see anything difficult about believing that this was supernatural. And I think I'm very bothered by people trying to find natural explanations for this. And I get asked this a lot. Like, such and such astronomer has been studying it, and he thinks it was a conjunction of, Saturn and Jupiter and I don't know, some other planet, or it was a combination of Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter.
Right.
And the thing is that, first of all, that has to have been seen at that time in that part of the world, because you can have a very bright conjunction of planets in one part of the world, but it's not seen everywhere. And secondly, no one's really actually been able to find anything around the time they think Jesus was born. That's another thing. We don't really know when he was born.
Right, because that's a cool thing about astrology is with the microscopes and stuff, or telescopes we have.
A lot of debate on that, but we don't really know.
Sure.
So so far they haven't really found anything to explain it. And the people who claim to have found something, their arguments are very poor. And I want to mention one. There's a guy who did a video called The Star of Bethlehem several years ago.
I think I remember seeing that.
And I'm asked about that quite often. I think his name is Rick Larson. I could be remembering wrong. Okay. I don't want to say the wrong guy's name, but I
throw the wrong guy under the bus.
If it's not you, Rick Larson, I'm sorry. But anyway, I think that's his name. I did a big post on that too, and I watched that video like 3 times, and I took notes. And one thing I noticed is he was using some ideas from what's called the Gospel in the Stars.
That was my next question.
Completely debunked. That's been debunked by so many people.
Interesting.
And that's this idea that God gave us the planets and the zodiac signs to give the gospel message. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. For one thing, special revelation doesn't come through nature. Nature shows us there's a creator God, but we don't get the gospel from nature. That is special revelation. And so, but that's not the only reason the Gospel in the Stars is false. It's based on bad data as well.
Okay.
It first came out like in the 1800s, and there was 2 or 3 people that came out with books on it. And then
that was when it first came out. Was in the 1800s.
In the 1800s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And
okay.
It was there was a woman named Frances Rolston, and then there was a couple of other people whose names I can't think of now that came up with it. I actually ran across one of these books when I had been a Christian for like 3 days, and I was in the bookstore.
Really?
Looking. Yes, I was in the Christian section, or may have been the religion section. I don't remember. It was a secular bookstore, and I was looking for Christian books, and I came across this Gospel in the Stars book. And I thought, what is this? And I started looking at it, and I was like, it's like they're taking astrology and trying to make it Christian.
Interesting.
I was just like totally repulsed by it. And I put it back, and I didn't know what it was. Well, I found out later because people started asking me, and then I had to start reading, reading about it. So he was I could tell he was making references to some of those ideas. And then he was saying other things that I could tell were off. And sure enough, when I did some searches, I found 2 astronomers who point out a lot of faulty things that he says. Okay. But his video and his talk is very convincing.
Sure. And especially if you don't know anything about a lot of astrologers, a lot of Christians got very excited about it. And, some churches showed it. And that's how I found out about it, is people started asking me about this video, Star of Bethlehem video. And I was like, wait a minute, what is this? So then I finally, I got a link to it and I watched it, or maybe I even got the DVD. I don't remember now. But anyway, I wrote on it, and I'm still occasionally asked about it. Yeah, because I listened to a couple different sermons that were actually on that from a really conservative church, and it sounded really cool. It's talking about how, you have, the centaur that's sort of 2 natures, pointing to Christ, who is both God and both man. You have the idea of, the hero crushing or bruising the head of Scorpio, or, the serpent, the snake, and it's like, oh, wow, that's some cool things. But it makes sense with what you said about how so much of it's interpretation to where, we now have the gospel, so a good, person can sort of read that into these because it's so subjective, so you can kind of backpedal in whatever. But yeah, if that only dates back to the 1800s, obviously it wasn't like, ancient cultures were looking at the stars and being like, oh, God's going to send a redeemer to crush the head of the serpent and redeem a people for himself, and by grace through faith.
Right, and the names didn't exist. The names that we're using, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, they're Latin. They're Latin names. It was the Romans who adopted astrology from the Greeks, and they adopted. Right. How the Romans took the Greek gods and gave them Latin names.
Right.
So the the astrology was the same thing, because the Greeks got astrology from the Arabs. And they were the first ones, and this is the latter part of Greece when they were beginning to get kind of degenerate.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the glory days of Greece. It was the latter part of Greece. And that's when they got into astrology and adopted astrology. And then that went to Rome, and the Romans took the Greek gods and they took astrology, but they gave it Latin, Roman names.
Sure.
So those names, they're pagan names. They're named after pagan gods and or pagan ideas and pagan myths.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's nothing there that has anything to do with the gospel. And people try to correlate it. And this gospel in the stars has been debunked, not just theologically, but it's been debunked astronomically speaking.
Okay.
As
Cool.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, that kind of coincides with the next question that we were going to have.
Which I think is probably about our last question. I think we've been going for a while, but this is just, I love the info you've been giving us. This has been awesome.
So
the gospel... Good.
The gospel in the stars, obviously, that's one way that astrology has kind of crept into the church. But what other ways have you seen that have really had an impact as far as astrology creeping into the church? And I know that you have a new book coming out really soon here called, it's about Richard Rohr and the Enneagram. I'm not sure if that's the exact title, but...
Yes, Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret.
Okay, now is that regarding the anything to do with astrology? Do you go into astrology in that? And how prevalent is that in the church? What are the main issues that you see, I guess would be the best way to put it?
Okay. Well, as far as astrology goes, I have a lot of Christians ask me, why does my sign fit me so well? Why does my zodiac sign? Why am I such a Gemini? Or why does Virgo really fit me? And it's because you're selective. You see traits about Virgo that you think you see in yourself. And so you think you fit it. But it's really, you probably have aspects of all 12 signs. We also tend to want to categorize ourselves. So we try to see ourselves a certain way that may not be accurate. There's a lot of psychological factors that go on that explain that. But as far as I do have a little bit in the book about astrology as far as how I have come to see a very strong parallel with astrology and the Enneagram. They both started off having nothing to do with personality at all. Astrology for, centuries was more of a kind of fatalistic, predictive thing. At first it was for rulers. It wasn't for individuals. So, like in Daniel, it's like the king had astrologers, and usually that was to warn him of things, that maybe an enemy was going to attack, or maybe he might get sick, or, I don't know. They probably gave these kind of predictive things. It didn't have anything to do with your personality or who you were. That only came about, like I said earlier, around the turn of the century when psychology came on the scene. Well, the Enneagram, which is much, much newer than astrology by about, I don't know how many centuries, depends on how long you think mankind has been on Earth. But anyway, the Enneagrams started in the 20th century. So
okay. So that's not an ancient thing, despite some of the claims.
It's not ancient at all. That's debunked. There's no historical evidence. And we go into that in detail in the book.
Awesome.
Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret. It started in the 20th century with a man named Gurdjieff, who did a 9-pointed diagram, and he was into these esoteric, kind of occult mystical philosophies, and he believed that this diagram was a diagram of the universe. You could put anything into this diagram, and he would play around with it mathematically, because it's 9 points, there are all kinds of things you can do mathematically with that. And he put a musical scale around it, and he did something called the law of 3 and the law of 7. And he thought that the Enneagram explained the universe. That was how he saw it. So it had nothing to do with...
Not even close with personalities.
No. And then his student was teaching it this way as well. And along with Gurdjieff's teachings, which were that you have to awaken to your your kind of your real essence. You have to climb this ladder of enlightenment. I don't think he used that word. I'm being very general, but you have to ascend, in this spiritual understanding.
Very
And
Gnostic.
he had steps that, very Gnostic. It was very Gnostic. You had to go through these steps, and to realize, the real truth, so to speak. And so the Enneagram was used to show the asleep, like when you're asleep versus awake. So awake is when you get awakened to this true reality. And so it still had nothing to do with personality. And then a man named Oscar Ichazo, who had a school in Arica, Chile, although he was Bolivian, he got hold of it, and there are different stories how he got hold of it. But he added to it, and he used it as a tool for discovering your pure essence. So he had what he called ego fixations. So there were 9 ego fixations. It looks like he may have used the 7 deadly sins and then added 2 to those. And these were things that you were fixated on, that you identified with, that covered up your true self. And your true self was really this pure essence, this pure divine essence. It's a very New Age Gnostic idea. And that's how he taught it. So even he didn't teach it in terms of personality. That happened with his student, Claudio Naranjo, who was a Chilean psychiatrist who was very interested in the use of psychedelic drugs for spiritual trips. And he actually did some of that at Ichazo's school. And then he left Ichazo's school, having learned the Enneagram from him. He went to California to a place called Esalen in 1970-71. Esalen was a breeding ground for the New Age, humanistic psychology, drug-taking, perennial philosophy, which I've been getting into more lately, and I'm doing more posts on that. And he taught it. Now, he's claimed in 2 different videos that are on YouTube that I have posted several times. And one of them more recently, he claims he got the information for the personality types from automatic writing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he's the one, he's the only one that taught the types. There wasn't anybody else doing that. He did that. And the people who learned from him then taught it according to these types. They got all of that from one man, Claudio Naranjo, and he claims he got it, most of it, via automatic writing in these 2 different videos. They're both on YouTube.
Wow.
One's a very short one. The other one is a long interview he's giving, and he really goes into some interesting stuff there. But he says towards the end, he mentions he got the types from automatic writing.
Wow.
He did believe in spirit contact, and so did Oscar Ichazo. They both did spirit contact.
Not in any way a Christian thing.
No. And so for our viewers that aren't aware, that didn't see our last video.
You really couldn't get further from Christianity than that.
Marcia,
and yet, that is what is in the church, this completely false tool.
Right.
It went into the New Age. And of course, New Agers love stuff like this.
Oh, yeah.
Because you can do whatever you want with it, just like an astrology chart. You take it, it has this basic design on it, the 9 types. And then you start adding all this New Age psychology and all these esoteric meanings to it. And they believed in using it to find your true self too. But true self in
all about
New Age
me
is a New Age concept.
Yeah, it really seems like the Enneagram focuses, and like you said, astrology, both, it's like aspect of self, focusing on self, learning about self.
Yes, and those are the parallels in their development, how they both came to be used later for personality analysis, how they're both used very much in the New Age, how they both have esoteric meanings behind them, and how neither one of them have anything to do with Christianity at all. And so I saw a lot of these parallels, because having been an astrologer, I totally understand sitting down with an Enneagram chart and then going through it and how you would interpret it. I can see I can't see myself doing it now, of course, but I could see how you could do that. It would be very much like reading an astrological chart.
Sure.
And actually, I heard of the Enneagram in the 1980s when I was in the New Age. I heard of it. I knew about it. I wasn't interested in it. So I didn't do it, but I heard about it. And then all of a sudden I'm hearing about it and Christians are doing it. It's mind-boggling.
Now, like for me, it seems so contradictory to this to the scripture. I mean, Christianity is a death to self and obedience to Christ. It's becoming more Christ-like, finding our identity in Christ.
Right.
What have you found as far as reaching out to people that are in that? Because I mean, I've heard tons and tons of people say, "Yeah, my church uses Enneagram. This person says they're 1. This one says they're a 3." What's the best way to reach out to those people, talk to them about it, and present it so that I guess it's not an attack against them, but trying to make them understand its roots? What would you say is your best approach?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm kind of brutally frank with people. And this is because they're Christians and I think they should know better. When I'm talking to a New Ager, I'm much more patient, and I don't expect them to understand.
Sure.
But a Christian, to me, I'm sorry, just should know better. Now, I have tried to talk to some. What I do first is, I give them the facts. I say, well, I don't know. Maybe you aren't aware of the actual factual history of this,
Probably
and that
most
it
of
has
them.
no scientific credibility. It did not come out of the field of psychology. So that's usually the first thing I'll say. I'll say it has no scientific or psychological validity. And if the person then wants more information, then they can say, "Oh, really? I won't." Well, how do you know that? Give me more information. Then you can, give them more information on it. So I try, I will try. I'll offer the information, or I'll say, here's a link to my article that gives an overview of the Enneagram, what it is, and, why it's not scientific. And then I hope they read it. Now, what's disconcerting to me, especially lately, is that when I've had these little mini dialogues with people, usually on Facebook, their response is basically they don't care that it's not scientific, and they don't care if it came from the New Age because it helped them. And so I have formulated a further response to that because I kept across that, and I'm like, well, if they don't care about the facts and they don't care that it's not scientific, it's like, well, there's got to be something else you can say. And it hit me that what they're doing is they're saying their experience of feeling helped by the Enneagram is more important than the facts.
Right.
And that's actually a New Age way of thinking.
It's just pragmatism.
Because New Ager will put experience over facts at the drop of the hat. They don't care, So if your experience helps you, if that was a good thing for you, then I don't care about the facts. Now I can understand a New Ager saying that. But so what the Enneagram is doing is not just showing people these false ideas of themselves, because I don't think most of the information that they think is true about themselves is probably true. There's probably bits and pieces that are true, but they're trying to put themselves in this category that's completely false. So that's one damaging effect. But the other damage, I think maybe even worse, is that they are now thinking that if they have an experience with something, that is what they're going to take as truth over actual facts. And that's very dangerous, because if you start thinking that way, then you've prepared your mind for the next thing coming down the line that's going to be worse than the Enneagram. But if you have a good experience with it, and you've already gone through having an experience with something, and you've been able to reject the truth about it because you like your experience, then you're going to do that with the next thing. And that may be worse. It may have more damaging effects than even the Enneagram. And that's what I am very concerned about.
Okay. Awesome. I think that's super helpful. Well, hey, this is gone on a little bit longer than we intended, but this has been fascinating. I've loved to have the opportunity to kind of pick your brain on this and break this out.
Sure.
Astrology just isn't something that I was ever really into, so I don't really have a background necessarily. But now, just looking around, I see so many people that are just so caught up into this stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, and it's getting more popular now with millennials are really into
Yes.
astrology, and
Very much so.
it's having a revival. And astrology's always had a lot of adherents and a lot of people interested in it, because if it's about you, we're very
Right. Who
self-oriented.
doesn't want to read about themselves?
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the appeals.
Awesome. All right. Well, any last closing thoughts for you, Marcia, before we call this a wrap?
Yes, I would say God's word is the final authority and truth for the life of a Christian and how we should think. And the more you immerse yourself in God's word, the more you study it and learn it, the more you see things how God wants you to see them, and you see them from his point of view. And then you're able to reject things that come along that are false. You're able to have that resistance to it and don't get pulled in, because you love God's word and God's word. And God says that's the sword. The God's word is the sword. And it's a sword both in that God uses the word to judge us and see us. The word is piercing, but it's also our sword for protection against these false ideas that are very seductive. And I think God, of course, knows how seductive these things are. And that's why he tells us over and over again, to meditate on his word, which means to ponder and think about his word, and to learn his word, and, to know him, to know Christ more and more as time goes by. And the more we get closer to the Lord that way. And I think one of the main ways is through reading the word.
Yes.
And I mean, there are other ways too, through worship and fellowship. But the more we do it through his word, the more equipped we are to resist these kind of seductions.
Amen. Awesome. All right. Well, hey, thank you again so much. And again, your website is Christian Answers for the New Age. Guys, be sure to check her out. Her website, her Facebook page just has phenomenal information, and just all across the board with New Age and things like that. So that is super helpful.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. You can pick my brain anytime. So.
Awesome. I might take you up on that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thank you guys all for watching this video. Again, this has been another episode of Worldview Warriors. We got Stephen Bancars coming on next month talking about meditation and mind-altering substances and all that cool stuff. So, grace and peace to you all. Wash your hands and dig into Scripture. We love you guys.